Hello and welcome to the Emotional Work Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. Now, as the regular listener will know, I am exceptionally interested in the interplay between identity, which includes both how we see ourselves and how other people see us. And I'm interested in the negotiations that take place and all of the emotions that come with them. And identity and emotion we featured on the podcast before with Professor Dornato in episode 12, Jessica Robles in episode 10, Georgian Isaac in episode 5, and SG Lenny in episode 2. Oh yes, and with me in episode 24. And today we're going to look more specifically into the emotion of shame. I don't think we've ever really taken a deep dive into a particular emotion so far. So we're going to go into shame into the podcast today, and that's going to link to some other episodes that we've got coming up. So we've got another guest in the pipeline, where we're going to talk a bit more about shame as well. So enough from me. Let's get our guest on the air. So I'd like to welcome to the podcast. Try that one again. I'd like to welcome to the podcast, Francesca Cardona. Hi, Francesca. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Phil. Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really, really excited to have you on as a guest.
Thank you.
And as per usual for this podcast, again, as the regular listener will know, we always open with an unexpected yet innocuous question. So my question for you, Francesca, inspired by what's been happening outside me over the last few days, is what does winter mean for you?
As you say, it's a very special winter, and means waiting. To be honest, waiting for the summer, waiting for this pandemic to be less bad on all of us. Waiting for a vaccine, waiting for warm weather where I can use my garden and more, and waiting to go to Italy. I hope to go in the spring when I will be vaccinated.
Okay, wonderful. And so I'm really fascinated by that idea of waiting. I've never thought about winter and waiting before, kind of waiting for the spring or waiting for things to come back together. Because winter for me, I associate with things being almost kind of stationary or maybe in stasis. There's like it's a moment for pause and where things maybe slow down a little. I suppose that goes against what I've said off air when we said hello to each other, because I've had a manic morning before getting together to record the podcast today. But I suppose when I look out on my garden, I see things almost in stasis, like they don't really move, they don't grow, once the leaves fall off the trees, it just kind of stays stationary. But maybe that's because they're waiting for the spring as well, maybe.
Yes, I think my bulbs that I put in a big pot the other day are also waiting for a bit of warm weather as well.
And if I take that theme of waiting, then, if that's all right. So one of the things that we talked about before, so as regular listeners will know, before I record the podcast, I always have a call and a chat with the guest before we get online. And one of the things that you mentioned was about using emotions as evidence. And because it's me and I'm fascinated by emotion, and I run my business and podcast is all about it. I really loved that idea, and I'm linking that with waiting, because sometimes I think it can be hard to or it can be hard. It can be easy to take things at face value without necessarily looking at what's going on at a deeper level, and that's where the emotion aspect could come in. So when you mentioned about using emotions as evidence, can you tell me a bit more about that, Francesca? Because I really loved that turn of phrase.
Sure. I think it's one, I would say, of the key tools in my trade, which is about being in touch with emotion in my work with organization, with individuals, and the way I use the terms is connected to the idea of emotion not just in terms of emotional intelligence, that we acknowledge that our emotions in organization, all of us, we experience strong, sometimes very difficult emotion, but is the sense emotion can offer you some intelligence about a situation and challenge in a sort of detective sense. I think, if I'm correct, detective have what they call the golden hour, when they go to a sort of crime scene, and they look at it and they try to sort of in a way engage with the feeling that is there, trying to see what should be there, what is not there, and that's how they start their investigation. So I always feel in sort of my work that beginnings are really important and really significant. So we often say with my colleague, everything is there at the beginning if we're able to see it. And beginnings start with all the initial emotion we experience in a situation, and we should wonder why we feel encountering a group or someone feeling lethargic or feeling anxious or feeling impatient. This is a sign of a dynamic that is going on under the surface.
Oh, there are some wonderful. I must compliment you on your ability to turn a phrase. There are some lovely phrases in there. And one I'd like to go back to, if that's okay, is you said in the beginning, everything is there. And so in the work that you do, then where is the beginning often, or where does the beginning happen? Is that when so like in my head I'm thinking it could be when like you have a first meeting with a client, or a first meeting with a team within a client organization. What would be the beginning for you in the work that you do?
Literally, the beginning is the first contact. Could be by an email, could be a telephone call, and that already give you some clues about how the person or the team or the leader engage with you. And then, of course, when you go into a building to meet people, also the building in a way speaks, and the way a room is arranged, the way people welcome or don't welcome you. You feel maybe ignored. You arrive and nobody knows that you are expected, or there is a very warm welcome. So all of that, and of course it's not just observing what's happening there, but also what is your reaction to the individual, to the environment, to the situation. So do you feel intimidated? Do you feel too close to the person? Do you feel curious? Do you feel, oh gosh, this is quite boring, I'm not sure if I want to do this bit of work? So all of this. And I think you were talking about expression. Is a mentor of mine that is now dead, who is a lovely man called Harold Bridger. And he was an organizational consultant and a psychoanalyst. And he always talked about listening to the music behind the words. So something like when you listen to song or an opera, maybe in a language you don't know, but let's say the music is good, you can tune into the main message that the music and the whoever has composed it want to convey to you. So you don't have to understand all the words. And I think I try, not always successfully, of course, but I try to engage with the music and the noises of organizations. And you can link this idea with the concept that is used in psychoanalysis, which is the countertransference, which is when you as a therapist, in a way, have experienced some emotions that come from the client or from the patient in this case. So it's a sort of connected idea.
So if it's okay, I'd like to stick with that idea for a moment and the listening to the music behind the words. And and in a way, I'd like to try and get a bit practical with it, if that's okay, because I think it might be interesting to hear how you do that. So because one of the one I say that because there's a lot of things that I know I do and in the past have done that have been quite intuitive. And when I've then reflected on or thought about, well, what is it that I'm actually doing? What is it that I'm noticing? Or what is it that I'm picking up on? Or what am I doing that's allowing me to be that detective or to hear the music behind the words? So yeah, I guess I'm curious about that a little bit more if I can. What strategies do you use to help you listen to the music behind the words?
Yes, I think obviously there isn't a recipe. Is
Mhm.
a question, I think, of a state of mind. And I think one thing that I really try to apply is not to look for solution, and sort of in
Okay.
a way accepting that I don't know, accepting I'm quite ignorant of a situation, and trying not to, give immediate answer, even if the team or the client, they're quite eager to take you in that direction, to ask for advice. I'm not saying you shouldn't give advice at some point.
Mm.
I think to immerse yourself, I did anthropologists do, immerse yourself in a situation, see what I'm understanding. And of course, try to, avoid prejudice. So that's why it's important in a way that you know enough of the organization to have some basic understanding. But I think sometimes if you know too much, you already come inevitably with prejudice. So to be quite fresh and try to not to immediately come to conclusion or think, oh, they should do this or should do the other, but really keeping an open mind. And that requires a lot of discipline, and also try not to sanitize some of the emotions that you might experience, because you might want to say, oh, just forget what I'm feeling at the moment. No, that can be an indication of something that is going on in that particular situation, in that particular team, and then using it to try to understand what is going on and eventually what the client needs and what might help him or them to feel better about the situation, find some kind of step forward towards some changes, address maybe some traumatic event that they have had to face, and so on. A lot of the organization I work with are, not all, but are in the public sector. And of course,
Mm.
as we know, and health service, the challenge of the task is huge, and that has an effect inevitably on the people who work in those settings.
Yeah, definitely. And so when you mentioned it earlier, that was another area that got my attention around. Well, there were two things. So one was about noticing what isn't there, and I'll come back to that one in a moment if I may. It was the bit around noticing how it affects you, and how being in a certain environment or being in a certain situation or being present in a certain meeting, noticing how that affects you. And again, I like what you said about not sanitizing yourself in terms of saying, well, that I shouldn't be feeling that, or that's not okay to feel that, and noticing, because it's that feeling or that sensation is an important point of information, if nothing else, for me. The bit I think I would say I've fallen foul of in the past is I've assumed that because I felt a particular way, other people or maybe everybody else in that situation has felt the same way that I have. So that's a lesson I've learned over time, that it's important to notice how I feel, but also it's important to remember that that's just how I feel. It isn't necessarily how everybody else feels.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, a small example is that comes to mind is someone who got in touch with me, and I felt, for some coaching. And I felt really grilled in terms of my qualification, my background, my experience. I wonder if it seemed unnecessary. She had my name through the chief executive of the organization. So, I expected that that would be something enough. But then, and I felt quite annoyed as a result.
Yeah.
And then I realized that when I finally saw her, that she was projecting into me what was her experience in the organization. That despite her training and qualification, she felt very much sidelined by her boss and felt actually very much lacking of confidence. So the fact that I sort of acknowledged that feeling of me on annoyance, but also noticed that she was grilling me, was quite helpful when we had to explore why she found herself in that position, what was happening in the organization, and so on.
Okay. So I said just now that I wanted to pick up on the noticing the things that aren't there, but I think I want to put that on a little kind of I want to park that for a moment, and stick with the example that you just gave there, because I think that links into the title of this podcast then, about looking at shame in particular. And because one of the things that you talk about in your book is you make a distinction between kind of organizational and personal shame, which I thought was a really interesting distinction to be made. So I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more. Oh, sorry, I was thinking I should probably say that. So your book is called Work Matters, and within that, then it's talking about a lot of the experience that you've had in the consultancy work that you do. Is that right? Would that be a good summary of the book?
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of stories about my work with clients, with teams, leaders, individuals. Yeah.
And I think that's wonderful, because I think sometimes what often I read sometimes is the more of the theoretical, or the some of the more the conceptual ideas that sit behind it. And what I really enjoyed about reading your work was the narrative aspect of it and the storytelling aspect of it. So I felt like I should give that context before I dive into the question of, in your book you say, I thought I should probably tell the listener what the broader context is. And then in your book then you talk about organizational and personal shame, which I thought was an interesting distinction. Could you tell me a bit more about kind of what sits behind that?
Sure. I mean, I think actually the two are linked.
Okay.
Shame often affects the organization and the individual. So I always think that the possibility of shame often lead organization to act too quickly and get rid of someone, so the bad apple, without thinking enough. But also the individual who feels shameful because feels that he or she has been so seen as doing something wrong, or has been experienced as someone not competent enough. And then that, of course, sometimes leads to a collapse of confidence and competence. And that I've seen it a lot. And I must say, I always often link a lot to what I experience with clients, with my own experience, because I'm sure, Phil, you might have sometimes experienced shame in situation. I remember that I was dropped, many years ago, from a leadership course where I was teaching. Quite suddenly, I didn't understand why it happened, and I thought it was quite unfair and badly managed. And despite I felt that, I felt still quite ashamed and exposed. And I think that gave me a clue later on to engage with the issue of shame with individuals and organizations. I felt more tuned in, and often is the case. If you have an insight into your own reaction to a situation that you might feel shameful, or other situation, you, of course, are much more able to link with your client's experience and situation. And, feeling of failure can evoke very primitive feelings of and strong emotions. And that could be also linked, of course, to individuals' background, their own personal history, their own vulnerabilities, and also is linked to organizations who are not well functioning. So I think sometimes if you've got the combination of an individual who is, let's say, a bit more vulnerable, has got a complex personal history, and an organization that's quite dysfunctional, is the perfect storm for, let's say, disaster.
Yeah. One of the, so you're absolutely right. You know, there've been times in the workplace when both in the workplace when I was employed and since then, you know, where I've been ashamed of things that have happened or mistakes that I've made. You know, one of those was when I was quite young, so I was 20, and I did something in a job that I had where I really should have been fired for what I did. And I wasn't, thankfully, which was a bonus. But the shame for me in that one initially kind of translated into anger, and really angry at myself for the mistake that I'd made. And it was, you know, a proper schoolboy error. You know, it was an easily preventable mistake that I'd made, and was a mistake where, you know, definitely should have been fired for what I did. And that yeah, I then got very angry at myself, angry at the situation, and then that anger kind of then fueled a real drive and a thirst for understanding more about emotions. Because my mistake was I was really angry at somebody, and I voiced that anger in a way that was quite hurtful, and I was very ashamed of the way that I did it. But it certainly kind of then started me on a quest, as it were, to understand more about emotions and what, you know, how they work and how they affect people and what they do and how they do it. Because the I guess the degree of, you know, shame then was a huge driver for other emotions then that took me on the quest to where I am now, I suppose, in a way.
Yes, I know. I can imagine, and I think sometimes is the possibility of exploring it, understanding where it comes from. And there's a colleague of mine called not colleague, but someone working in my field called Paul Hoggett, who makes a distinction between what he called depressive shame and paranoid shame. And I think the idea of the depressive shame is, in a way, is a quite healthy emotion, because, you know, we can learn from having made a mistake, from our disappointment, and we are sort of more open to resolve what has gone wrong and meets, our goals. While paranoid shame is a much more corrosive sense of humiliation, where we feel we're not good enough, so it's all or nothing, and so we feel quite uselessness. And I think one of the intervention that I try to make when I am faced with clients that bring difficult situation where they may be some of their mistake have been exposed, or they've been promised something that hasn't happened, and they feel not recognized and shameful because everybody expected them, for example, to get a promotion or something like this. And try to help them to move into what sort of this depressive shame position, which is more in terms, okay, this has happened, it's not a tragedy, it's something that you could find way of understanding and get better at it, rather than, either blaming someone else, which is often the tendency, they've got a very bad boss, a terrible organization, so it's all their fault. It's never completely their fault, it's always a combination of the two. Or the despair and the wish of giving everything up. I can't stay here, that's terrible, I have to sort of disappear. And so it gets very polarized. Well, the attempt to say what is your part, what is the organizational part, and what can you do about it. But sometimes it takes a long time to help a person to get there.
Mm. Yeah, because you use the example of Joe in your book, don't you? As for someone who was promised a new role, but then was passed over, and the trying to shift them from that depressive shame, from the paranoid shame aspect to the depressive shame aspect.
Yes, and that was an amazing example, because this was someone who, on the whole, was well positioned, was quite senior, and felt very much part of the organization, almost a surrogate family. And then this happened, and he felt so humiliated because everybody expected him to get the role, but in an excessive way. And then you can see that it was, in a way, the combination of his personal history. He had a quite complex background. So in some way, there was some feeling that despite his success, it was still a bit of an imposter. So that in a way, and that incident, made it much more powerful, the feeling that I shouldn't be here. I'm not really worth what I thought I was. And then this was also combined with the organization, which was very competitive, and to some degree quite ruthless. So in a way, as I was saying earlier, it was a bit of the perfect storm. And sometimes, the personal, organizational, in this case, not organizational shame, but you can't just look at an individual. You have to look more broadly at that is also a systemic issue sometimes. So it's not just the individual who might not be good enough, but there is also a culture of the organization that contributes to a difficult situation.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm a big fan of understanding and reflecting or considering the systemic nature of things, which I know I want to come on to explore with you a little bit more later. I'd like to take a bit of a detour into shame a little bit more, if that's okay. And in particular, it's around the potential association, or the association that I've made through some reading that I've done, between shame and disclosure. And it was when you used the phrase when a mistake was exposed earlier on. And one of the things that one of the distinctions that I make in some of the work that I do is between, say, guilt and shame. So and one of the things with shame that I often find is that the preference or the tendency when there's shame is to hide that, and actually to not disclose it, and to keep that shame hidden, or to keep the cause of that shame hidden, rather than being something that that is open, or something that is disclosed, and something that is openly talked about. And I read a lot in the kind of general, and this is an unfair generalization, but I'm going to make it anyway. I read a lot in the kind of a lot of the workplace rhetoric around mistakes, and how organizations should be embracing of mistakes and making it safe for people to make mistakes, and we need to create safe places where people can make mistakes in the right way. And theoretically, I get that, and I support that, because I think humans are fallible. That's what they us as human beings, we make mistakes all of the time, and the more we hide those mistakes, the potentially because of shame, the harder it is then for individuals to learn, for organizations to learn, for teams to learn, and so on. But there's almost like this kind of these two forces that are almost pulling against each other, which is saying, we want a culture where people can make mistakes, and it's okay to do so, versus when somebody does make a mistake, they are often then I can't remember the word that you used earlier on, but they're exposed, and they may be vilified, or they may be kind of hung out to dry because of the mistake that they've made, when actually what they've done is they've just been human, and they've made a mistake. So I guess I'm talking a lot. I'm not really asking a question. So let me try and see if I can formulate a question in my head. In your experience in the work that you've done, um, is unearthing shame a difficult task because people tend to hide it? Is that something that you find? I think is my question.
Yes, I think, I mean, as a generalization, you can say that. I mean, my sense is, and maybe I also being quite simplistic in obviously for the sake of this discussion, but if you have an organization where there is a good enough, I use good enough is the term that's in,
Mhm.
used by Winnicott, the psychoanalyst who talk about good enough parenting. But if you got a good enough management system, that, I think things usually, um, you know, people feel more able to um, uh, be open about mistakes. Interesting enough, in Joe's case, there was a transition. He was with a new manager, so the relationship with the trust relationship wasn't there, and maybe the incoming, the new manager leader didn't understand what it meant to Joe, this promotion.
Mm.
Didn't um, uh, understand it, the consequence that could have happened as a result of not getting the job. I mean, luckily he was in coaching, and I think I'm not sort of saying that I solved the situation, but I
Mhm.
helped him to go through what happened and try to unpack it rather than, being completely paralyzed by that experience. But I think good management, good structure are key for a more transparent, more open organization. So if you go beyond the cosmetic, sort of mottos of organization, but if you got people who are managers, who are psychologically present, who are there for the people they manage, I mean, that makes a huge difference, I think. And I've always found that when is the case, these difficulties can be overcome, and sometimes actually can bring something new or better.
Mm. Okay. And then thinking about the recovery from shame side of things, then. So I guess I talked earlier on about how my recovery from shame was fueled by anger at myself and the situation, and wanting then to go and beginning my quest to find out more and just assimilate as much knowledge and information and skills as I could. What sort of things have you done or do you do with the individuals or organizations that you work with to support them with recovery from shame?
The first of all is exactly what you did after the anger, which I completely understand, because I had exactly the same reaction as you did when I was dropped from that course, that I felt
Mm.
so angry towards the organization. And when you pass that sort of period in which you feel, really angry, cross with whoever, done something that you feel was unfair and so on, and then you, as a result, you felt shamed, I think is, first of all, is acknowledging your part in it.
Mm.
So that there always is an element of you, in terms of, you might have too high expectation, you might delude yourself about your skills. There's always something that you contribute to the issue. So in a way, I think this is the first step, and
Mhm.
not do what we say in my trade, the splitting, so that you split. You said, and the organization is responsible, or I am fully responsible. That, as I said at the beginning, that is a
Mm.
combination. So it's really creating a space where you can, unpack that and see what is me, what is organization, what is my boss, and and then what realistically can be done about a situation. What is the bit that I can expect, but what are reasonable expectations about the other people involved. And it's sort of also coming back to reality, but it needs unpacking, and also sometimes needs to connect in an individual to something that is deeper than that. As I was saying in the case of Joe, there was something profound about his sense of worth because of very difficult background that he had. He had sort of very distant parents. He left home to go to university to never return back home, basically. So it was someone who, although he's done very well, he didn't have a firm base. And then so when something like that happened, he felt much more troubled, that maybe someone would have been more confident. He might have sort of shaken that off and considered that one of those things that happened, maybe a bit disappointed, but he wouldn't have felt so threatened. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, you have. Yeah. So you said, it's the unpacking and acknowledging your part in it, acknowledging others' parts in it, and others I'm using in a loose term that could be individuals or the organization, or acknowledging others' parts in it, and then thinking was the third step. Well, what realistically can be done then? So what realistically can be done to improve or change or learn or make better, or whatever the next steps might be. You also reminded me of a situation where I was working with a senior team, and the stimulus was, or the stimulus of the story, I guess, is that one of the team had a breakdown, for want of a better phrase, a breakdown in the workplace, and needed some intensive help and support to get better, and to kind of get back to the point where they were fit again. And what I found really interesting, and I can use the interesting frame looking back, I got really angry at the time actually, was a number of the other members in that team and their colleagues said, "Oh, I saw this coming. Like I've seen them." I've seen them change physically over the last few weeks, and I've noticed this change in them, I've noticed that change in them, I've noticed they're doing this, and I've noticed they're doing that. And it's a shame they couldn't deal with it. And I was like, but you do realize that everything you just outlined is, in my head, you being complicit in the creation of this situation. So you've noticed these changes in behaviors, you noticed these changes in attitude, you noticed these changes in appearance, and yet you did nothing with them. So we as a team need to now reflect about what's our role in this then. What's our role in this outcome that we have now. So the outcome we have is this person struggling and they need some help to get better. All right, but what's our role in it? And the team didn't want to face that. There's not something they wanted to explore. And I said, well, no, because we have a role to play in this as well. We're that person's colleague, we're their team, and yet individually, so and so and so and so and so and so and so. So you've said to me that you've noticed changes, yet we've done nothing with that. So yes, that individual needs to make some changes, but surely we as a team have to do the same thing. And that was a really tricky conversation to navigate, because the again, a risk of generalization, but the team were really resistant or reluctant to engage in that discussion.
I can't agree more, and I think is always so much linked, and it's very interesting how people, organization, team members, leaders sometimes turn a blind eye, and then surprise, surprise, something happened. But in a way, everybody knew that something was going on. They didn't want to see it, and I think to acknowledge the link, to acknowledge that you are interconnected, that if we are someone working in an organization, whatever happens to you is connected to a team, to your leader, to the whole organization, to the task. So you can't just see an individual in his isolation. It's all connected. And so I completely agree with your perspective. I think that is very important. And ideally is, maybe I can come with a brief example.
Please. Yeah, please do.
I was, someone referred to me, a doctor who was accused of bullying, and basically they didn't suspend him, but they decided that he needed some coaching. So it wasn't sort of what we call an easy assignment, because you feel this person, what can I do? It might be perceived as punishment. But I think the work they tried to do was, first of all, again, to try to see what was his responsibility, what was his organization responsibility. But also, in my contract with the organization, I said, okay, I'm prepared to see this individual and see what is behind his behavior, but I want to be able to come back to you and tell you what I picked up, that the organization might have done differently, or maybe some of the mistakes or systems not in place. And luckily enough, in this case, the person was very open-minded. And so when I finished the work with this individual, I went back to the organization. I said, I think you should think about these issues, which are in a way belong to you, not to the individual. So yeah, the individual might have been a bit of a bully, or might have, but also the organization has some responsibility for this. It's not always possible, because often organization was to dump you people who think they are a trouble individual and they create trouble, but it's never just this story. There are more stories, more different ways of looking at that.
Yeah, definitely. And that dynamic, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. I feel like it should be nature, but I'm not necessarily, I don't think necessarily the right phrase. That the interconnectedness, I think, is something that is often overlooked. And yeah, I think that's been a really useful exploration. Thank you, and thank you for sharing your example as well. And I guess just to close that last example off, if I can, is so I've had similar discussions with some clients that I work with when I've been doing, say for example, getting involved in some culture change work, or organizational change work, where I've been asked to come in and support the implementation of a change initiative or a change program, and when I then, to put it politely, when I rub up against some of the systemic challenges within the organization, some clients seem to, they're more willing than others to want to listen to and explore some of those systemic aspects that I might rub up against. And I suppose I'm putting myself in the listener's shoes now then, and thinking, all right then, Phil and Francesca, you're saying that that these systemic aspects are important, but not necessarily organizations or teams want to hear about those systemic issues or those systemic aspects. How do I approach that then? How can I approach a conversation about some of the systemic aspects of an organization, if the organization doesn't want to hear it? And I know that wasn't necessarily a question that I said I was going to ask you in the podcast, but I guess I was just thinking that if I was in the listener's shoes, it might be useful to have maybe a couple of tactics or some techniques or some approaches that they could use to, if they had to address some of the systemic side of things. What might we recommend? So I guess that's a question to both of us, but I'll leave the floor to you first.
I think, I mean, as in all these things, there isn't a recipe, but I think what I would say, to always have in mind that there is this other dimension, and try, to make it more visible for the people around you. So if this, instead of, and trying to pick up this sort of tendency of, I think, personalized issue in organization, which I think is quite common, unfortunately,
Mm.
and see that, of course, the person sometimes has got a lot of responsibility for something that's happened, but there is always a dimension that is wider. And what we haven't referred to is, of course, the task of the organization is that sometimes is very challenging, it's very difficult. So in a way, people become very defensive, and they don't allow themselves to be open and available. And there is the context of around us,
Mm.
and that is also important. Of course, you might intervene in an organization. I was thinking the time we're living now, organization are under different kind of pressure. So that also has an impact. We are in a pandemic.
Mm.
So all of that has an influence, and we are all affected, but all affected differently. But so my suggestion, my only suggestion would be keep that dimension, broader dimension, alive, and don't put it in the sort of aside, but make it part of the conversation we're having. If you are an employee, if you are a leader, of course, if you are a consultant or a coach.
Mm. So I agree with you. There's no recipe, and there's no set format that I think you could take. So I think the things I would share then would be one, is to, so one of my phrases that I use a lot is there's always more going on than you think. There's always something else. There's always more to it. It's never as simple as you think it is, because that's, again, as humans, we like to make things simple. We like to quote one of my friends, a guy called Cliff Lansley, we are cognitive misers. We're cognitively lazy. If we can find a shortcut, then we will find. If we can find a shortcut and a simple answer, we'll find the shortcut and the simple answer. And so using that as a way to engage a conversation, say, well, what else could be going on, or what else is going on, or what else could what else is at play, what else could be happening, is a way of coming at it. And then we could then coming into the 3 steps that you talked about earlier on, acknowledging what's the individual's part, what's the organization's part, what's the team's part, and so on, could be one way of doing it. And I think my other one, and I'm now thinking I've been primed by your detective analogy that you used earlier on, but is to have some evidence to support the the possible connections that you're making. So one of the things I noticed when I was working with a different organization is, so I was there on a fairly long-term assignment. So I was doing 3 days a week for nearly 2 years. And one of the things that I noticed was that Mondays could be really hit and miss. So Mondays is a day in the office. Monday was always my office day. So I always committed I do kind of one definite day in the office a week, which is always a Monday, because Monday was meetings day. I never got any work ever done. I just did meetings all day. I'd ended up with a longer to-do list at the end than the beginning. But anyway, and then I'd have a day at home, and then I'd have my third day of the week would either be in the office or at home, depending on where I needed to be. And I kept finding that my Mondays could be really hit or miss. And the pattern that I deduced was, depending on the behaviors that were displayed by the senior team in the meeting room that happened, because there was a meeting room in the office that was glass walled, so everybody could see in. And depending on how that meeting went and ended, seemed to correlate with whether my Mondays could be a hit or miss day. Because when it went well and they had a good meeting, then they tended to be a hit day. And when those meetings went poorly and they had a bad meeting, then it tended to be a miss day. And what I noticed was that emotions would emanate, or they'd almost kind of come out in waves from the meeting room. So as people were arriving into the office, they would see that the senior team was sat down around this table, and they'd be watching, maybe not like watching, like they're watching a TV, but they'd be noticing what was happening and noticing how how people were interacting with each other when they were talking, and then when the meeting would end, again, you'd notice how different people left the meeting. Did they storm out and stomp down the office and get their head down at the desk, or did they stop and say hello to people on the way, and some of those things. So and the conversation I had with the team was kind of almost presenting my case, maybe in a bit like of a Columbo way, maybe because I was a bit clumsy.
And yes.
But to say, this is what I notice. When I notice that, on these different occasions, these things have happened, and then this has been the feeling in the office that day, and on these other days, these things have happened, and this has been the feeling in the office on those days. And to what extent are you aware that the way that you guys interact and how you are with each other then resonates out into the office? And they had no awareness at all. And some of them just said, "Oh, I don't think that's right, Phil." And I said, "Well, maybe it's not, but this could just be my view. But this, based on what I'm noticing and what I'm picking up on, this is what I think." So we then changed the strategy and we moved the location of the meeting. So I said, "Well, can we move the meeting, instead of you doing the meeting in that office where you normally do it? Can we do it somewhere else?" So because there was a number of different teams within the organization, so by moving the senior teams meeting from one room to a room in a different part of the office meant that nobody else saw what was going on. So if they were having the meeting where the marketing team is, nobody in marketing cares about this senior leadership team meeting, so nobody's really watching them or paying any attention. And what it meant was they were then much more kind of even Mondays after that. There wasn't this spiking, this up and downness of kind of how people felt that day. It was really interesting to see and experience. Sorry, go on.
No, very good. And I think, the thing about evidence is very, very important. And it's one of the things I teach as well as do consultancy. I and my colleague, we always talk about evidence before formulating hypotheses about what is our understanding of what is going on. And I think accumulating evidence that helped you to, give a in a way, well-informed response of input, and looking for those. I mean, is I think is quite essential.
Mm.
And I liked your story.
Oh, thank you. All right. So I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is to start to kind of bring us together, and start to kind of bring the podcast to a close, if that's all right. There's one area that I wanted to explore a little bit more, because we talked about the shame side of things a lot, and in your preceding chapter to shame, you talk about vulnerable leadership, and I know there's a quite a popular kind of researcher and practitioner out there, a lady called Brené Brown, and she talks about the links of vulnerability and shame, and I wondered, because those two chapters kind of follow each other. So you've got vulnerable leadership as a preceding one, and then shame is the one that follows. And I guess, how do you see vulnerability and shame going together, I think, is the question I wanted to ask before I then start to bring us together and close off the podcast, if that's okay.
I think vulnerability can apply both to individuals, leaders, and organizations. So I think you might feel vulnerable, and then, in a way, I think I referred to it earlier, you might be much more, in a way, exposed or prone to shame, because if you are someone who has an inner sort of strength, but also a quite robust sense of your identity. And I could talk at length about when the sense of course of attachment. You are someone who has experienced as a child a strong attachment, and then you're able later on in life to feel worth and strong in your identity. So you're less vulnerable to
Mm.
shame. People who are don't have that, and I've for different reason,
Mhm.
you might feel much more likely to experience shame in the way I was describing, in a more paranoid way, in which this
Mm.
is, you see it, and whatever happened is an attack to you and to your identity. Well, if you are you have you're more confident in in who you are, you of course experience it differently. And that applies to organization, because if you have an organization that on the whole is quite solid and has got a quite robust management structure. And I think I make a comparison to, leaders as sort of almost parents of organizations. So in a
Mhm.
way, leaders who can take up a parental role, parental in inverted commas, of course, in
Mhm.
relation to staff, so they can, be reliable and people can rely on them. And of course, it is less likely to happen. But that doesn't mean that doesn't happen, but the
Mm.
consequence of it are less um, strong or less disruptive. And nowadays, of course, shame. You are shamed in the media, in the news.
Mm.
I have a client, for example, who has been he has been named in the media, and that is quite devastating, because you're not talking about the public of my example,
Mm.
Joe example, because that was within the organization. But if you are exposed, for example, outside, really, where millions of people,
Yeah.
that's really difficult. But again, if you've got an organization that can support you, that can be minimized. If you're someone on the whole feels that quite confident in your skills, in your work, and you might, you might find it difficult, but you can recover.
Mm.
But if you're someone who is less confident and feel more vulnerable inside, that might be really problematic.
Wonderful. Thank you, Francesca. That was a very nice summary. I liked that. That was good.
Thank you.
Um, okay. So what I'd like to do then is to bring us together, I think. And so one of the ways that I tend to wrap up the podcast then is to ask around any kind of books or resources. So maybe kind of books as well as your own, of course, which I'll put a link to in the show notes. Are there any books or videos or talks or research papers that you think it would be good for the listeners to go and have a read of or to look at?
But apart from my book, I think the book in my kind of world that has been really seminal
Hmm.
is The Unconscious at Work, um, which is called the Tavistock Approach to Making Sense of Organizational Life, and is
Okay.
edited by Anton Opolzer and Vega Roberts, and is published by Routledge. And
Hmm.
it was a first edition in 1994, but now
Wow.
there's a
Okay.
new edition that has a section on. The first edition was mainly aimed for people working in the caring profession, health
Hmm.
sector. The second edition has got a section, quite a rich one, for people working in sort of private sector in business.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
that's, I would say, is the most obvious. And one of the quality of this book is that it's very accessible. It's written in plain English and
Mm.
very clear. And I think there are a lot of vignettes, a lot of cases. Um, so I certainly think is something to recommend to a lot of people.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll make sure I put a link to that one as well as your book in the show notes then. Anything else?
Um, I think um, I mean I didn't expect this question. So there are lots of books that are of interest. But I think this is the one. There is another one. I think it's called Working Below the Surface. Is again done
Okay.
by a group of colleagues in the Tavistock tradition, and I think it's a very interesting book as well.
Okay.
I had in mind, because I thought you said that you might want to some recommendation also for people to invite on
Oh,
your
yes, please. Yes,
podcast.
please. Yeah.
So one is Vega Roberts that I mentioned, who is a colleague who is the co-author of The Unconscious at Work. And the other one is, which is relevant to your podcast, is a clinical psychologist who is now an author and writer. She's wrote this wonderful novel called A Good Enough Mother, and published by Faber and Faber. Also last year, 2019, and is the story of, I would say, the interconnection between personal and professional life of Ruth, who is psychologist, psychotherapist, and what happens, the complexity of life at work and also at home in terms of her personal life. And it's sort of a thriller, but not a thriller, a real thriller, but in terms of, in a way, your podcast, Emotional at Work, I think
Wonderful. That's fantastic. I will look out both of those people. Thank you very much. Okay. And if people wanted to get hold of you, Francesca, to find out some more, is there a way that you would like them to do so? I could put a link to your website in the show notes. Would that be the easiest way for if people wanted to get hold of you and find out some more for them to do so?
Yes, I think the obvious way would be through my website, where there is my email, and also LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So this is the two public spaces. So I would like to hear from anyone who is interested to continue the conversation. Yes, that would be great.
All right, I'll do that. Then I'll put a link to the website and to your LinkedIn profile as well. And I think all that remains then is for me to say, is there anything else then, Francesca, anything else that you're thinking, feeling, or want to say before I close us off?
I think I've enjoyed this conversation very much. I mean, I felt a bit anxious, as obviously, because I'm not used to being interviewed.
Yeah.
It's sort of preparing and doing it made me think a little bit differently about some of the sort of what I wanted to, what I've done, and what I wanted to say. And maybe the key thing is, in conversation with you, is this constant, you said, what else? And I was thinking a constant interplay between things, individual, environment, organization, personal, professional. What else is there? So I think that's and is an invitation not just to your listeners but to myself, to try to do that, which I try to do, but to be reminded I think is important. And thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been great to have you as a guest, Francesca. Thank you so much for coming on the Emotional Work podcast.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, and if you got this far, you must be interested in the role that emotions have in the workplace, either within individuals, between people in teams, or in organisations as a whole. So head over to the Emotion at Work hub, which you can find at community.emotionatwork.co.uk. Thanks for listening.